Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week, Max Gulker, Senior Research Fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research. We're going to talk about, get this, Austrian economics, Hayek, Elizabeth Warren and why she's wrong, the Yang Gang, and fish. You have to check this out. Max, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
So when I told my guys that we were going to spend an hour talking about jam bands as a metaphor for the market process, they stared blankly at me,
right,
like I was an idiot.
Yeah.
So we'll see how this goes. But we were talking at PorkFest, which is a gathering of pretty hardcore libertarians who are repopulating the state of New Hampshire,
exactly,
in hopes of making it Galt's Gulch. And I was enthusing about my love for the Grateful Dead, and you were enthusing about your love for fish. And obviously, there's a generational connection between these two bands, and
Sure.
and I actually think that the metaphor is quite apt. But before we get into that, why don't you tell everybody, you're a senior economist at the American Institute for Economic Research.
Indeed.
Tell me a little bit about yourself and
Yeah.
about this wonderful place in
Yeah.
Bering North.
So-
What is it? Where is it?
Great Barrington,
I
Massachusetts.
already
It is
screwed that
the literal southwest corner of Massachusetts. It's people in Boston think that Massachusetts ends in Amherst, Springfield. There's another hour left of Massachusetts after that, and we're all the way on that side.
And that's like real America, right?
Exactly. I'm from Indiana, and I tend to tell people it's more like the upper Midwest than it is like New England.
Yeah.
In terms of the people, at least. So I'm really fortunate to have found this place, and I think the theme really that you're talking about is sort of, responding to accidents, really, in a way, responding to what's not predictable. I went to college at the University of Michigan after I grew up in Indiana. I studied economics. I fell in love with economics basically from like day one of Econ 101. And that's the very, sort of mainstream supply and demand curve, Econ 101 that you get. And at that point I was, kind of planning everything. And I said, I'm going to go work for a couple of years, then I'm going to go to grad school. And, I got into Stanford, which is obviously a very, highly regarded program, and got there. And that's when like life really started throwing unexpected things at me for the first time. And, I went in thinking I was going to be this famous professor and have this body of work with my name on it and all these things. And I got there and, had this very mathematical kind of bent to it that's really the mainstream kind of what they do. And, I thought I was good at math coming in. I'm probably pretty good at math. I found out what really good at math meant. And I found out that I wasn't really suited to a life of do something groundbreaking in the next 3 years. Come see us if you need, if you need help or anything like that. That wasn't, that I tended to think in sort of smaller chunks and that kind of thing. I got my degree. I studied kind of technology and markets and applied microeconomics. And I went back to work in the private sector for a bunch of years. Politically, the other interesting thing about me is I was raised kind of in the conservative heartland by kind of post-hippie, very left-wing parents. And so I kind of had this weird juxtaposition. I really didn't know much about libertarianism. My education at Stanford, this kind of shocks people now, sort of our friends, that, we never heard the name Hayek or Mises or people like that.
That is shocking that
right?
that the Hoover Institution is based at Stanford. I would not really thinking much about it. Stanford to me would at least provide a balanced view of economics, but apparently not.
Well, they're educating you to basically publish highly quantitative, cutting-edge work in like a few journals.
Yeah.
That's kind of what the vanguard of the field there is doing. But so I was always I had always kind of moderated, and I think I had the gift in kind of growing up with people that were very different than my parents, of getting different messages and saying like, well, okay, I like all these people, so maybe there's something going on other than one of them is wrong or one of them is stupid or that kind of thing. And so
it's possible that people on
Right.
far sides of an argument, one of them might not
Right.
be evil.
Right, exactly. And I developed almost, I think, sort of an intellectual interest in thinking about, okay, why do people disagree? What's the point of departure? That kind of thing.
And at this point, you're coming at it kind of as a moderate
It's like
lefty.
a center. It's like a Democrat voter, I would say. Not a little. Not. Yeah, I would call my mom today. Like, I think I may have talked her out of liking Elizabeth Warren, but we'll see. I was never quite there. But actually, a sort of transformative moment for me, right when I was getting my PhD or right afterwards, was Obama getting elected. And I didn't like George W. Bush. I thought he was, doing a bad job. I thought here was this guy that was going to bring good governance and unite people. And it was like a year later that I saw that wasn't happening. And I was fortunate enough, I guess, to sort of take a step back and say, everybody blames, the other party. Everybody, and this looks like the mirror image of what was going on with Bush. And I thought to myself, maybe it's not possible to be a good president.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something systemic. And then I started almost accidentally happening upon other strands of economics that really made me think. I was working in the private sector. I was doing consulting for lawyers and big financial litigation around 2008. You can imagine that was kind of interesting. And I don't remember when I happened upon it was doing research for a consulting project. Hayek's paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, and I knew Hayek. I knew he didn't like Keynes. I knew, that kind of thing. But
is that Milton Keynes or
right?
John,
Yeah,
John
exactly.
Maynard?
I think on Twitter I said something like Adam Rothbard is spinning in her grave or something like that. Anyway, I think a lot of your viewers, listeners are going to know a little bit about that. But Hayek was somebody who kind of amazingly saw the world as this kind of complex network before that was something people talked about, and thought about kind of how information flowed through it, and thought about how in the middle you can't plan out what's going to happen once you get to millions of people, especially. I wrote about last year the job guarantee, which was this kind of insane big ticket plan from the left, and I remember thinking to myself, if we had an economy of 100 people, this might not be a bad idea. You might be able to execute this. And Hayek had a sense, I think, in some ways that a lot of us, even who agree with him, don't quite have. We have to turn on like our real thinking brains to do what he does. That basically, if I'm a central planner and I'm telling everybody in this room what they're going to do, I know way less, unavoidably, inescapably, than sort of the collection of dispersed knowledge that everybody has. And almost by just law at that point, I'm going to come to worse outcomes. The way I put it to people now is, what if the government had to find you a job and got your resume and that's all they knew about you? That was like the biggest intellectual lightning strike of my life. That was like one of the few times that I read something and said, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, that is the thing for people to read if you want to try to understand the entire body of Hayek's work.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it's pretty complicated, and it's a little bit of a slog because of his German language roots. But this short little essay, I think it's five pages maybe. Yeah. And by the way, there's a tradition on this show. Whenever I mention Hayek, people have to drink. So,
all right.
so we're going to take a break. But so this idea, you went from basically thinking, and it is kind of the good progressive dream that if we just found the right people,
right,
and they're a little bit smarter than us because they all went to Stanford,
right,
and have their PhDs.
Exactly.
And
I was pretending to be one of them.
And if we could just give them enough power and discretion to fix things will get better.
Right.
And that was why you supported Barack Obama.
Exactly. And it was, and right around then, when I saw that wasn't going to happen, and I saw it pretty quickly, I thought to myself, okay, what are the things my parents have always, taught me to care? Well, what are the things that I think are sort of the well-meaning progressive agenda, helping poor people, access to services like education and healthcare? And I thought, what progress has the government made in my life since 1978 when I was born? Almost nothing. And that's actually a message that I have for my progressive friends now. Like, the things that are considered big victories happen from the bottom up, like society's views on gay people, for instance, which is really about individuals getting to know each other, and who they are. So, in any event, I think that really got me almost politically disinterested in a way. I thought, well, we're not going to solve these problems.
Cheers.
Certainly.
By the
Yes.
way.
Yeah. Cheers to Frederick.
Yeah. This, by the way, this style might impress you or distress you, but this is something we obsess about on this show. It's a hazy double IPA.
It's delicious.
By one of my favorite breweries, Other Half, and it itself is a great metaphor for beautiful things that happen in unplanned economies.
Right.
Because there is a heated argument within the brewing community. There is a generation of brewers that despise this style. They're like, "That's not beer.
Right.
How dare you do that to
Right.
to my beloved West Coast IPA?"
Yeah.
And to me, it's a great example of things that can happen that could never have been planned, could never
Right.
have been conceived of.
Right.
Just 5 years ago, this would not be a thing.
Exactly. And speaking of not planned and conceived of, I got to a point where I was a little bit through with New York. I was a little bit through with consulting. I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, and I kind of went up to the Berkshires, had a friend there. Berkshires are where Great Barrington is in Massachusetts. Beautiful. Highly recommend it. And thought I was going to take a little break for like a couple months maybe and plot out what I was going to do next. And I did not know there was a think tank there. And a friend of mine one day said, "Oh, I was in the sauna, the gym, talking to this guy, and he works for an economic think tank in town." I said, "No, he doesn't." And that was actually at a point right before the folks who lead us now came in, Ed Stringham and Jeffrey Tucker, who people, fans of the show will know.
Jeffrey's been on the show, Jeffrey
Yes.
Tucker.
Yes.
We will get Ed Stringham on the show at some point.
I think that would be terrific. Ed's written a book about private governance that I think actually is another thing that answered a lot of my questions.
Yeah.
I fell in with those guys, and I had, already become a little bit enthused by Hayek. I had discovered some other work that's by folks associated with something called the Santa Fe Institute, which is about complexity in economics, which is really Hayek, except Hayek says you can't do a lot of mathematical modeling. They do a lot of mathematical modeling.
Yeah.
I've actually never gotten into the technical side of it much, but the intuition is so complementary that it's another thing that kind of reshuffled my deck a little bit.
Yeah.
And, I knew that I knew enough to be intrigued, and I could see that they were fairly radical. And I didn't, I like people like Ludwig von Mises. I had heard the name. I knew there was some place in the South that had his name. I knew that, but I didn't really know much about these thinkers. I didn't really know much about their approach. And I ended up with bosses, basically, who trusted me and who let me kind of flail about and find my way a little bit. And, I was on board enough with what we were doing from the beginning that was fine. And it started occurring to me that a lot of the stuff that my parents and my friends, and for a long time, I sort of thought government should be able to deliver, that are good things, could be delivered a lot more successfully if we would trust our society, our markets, and people acting freely and cooperating freely to do. It's just that it's not a plan, and that doesn't intuitively register with people.
Yeah, well, it's not a central plan, and
Exactly.
you used a phrase that I think is a Stringham phrase: governance, not government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we do a pretty lousy job of explaining the governance side of that.
Yes.
The fact that even if there isn't an Elizabeth Warren plan to restructure the tech industry, it doesn't mean that there's not rules. It doesn't mean that there's not accountability. It doesn't mean that people will sort of spontaneously develop pathways to figure stuff out. And that's the entire Hayek project.
Exactly. And I think that one place where the economists kind of in this area can really do a little bit better is by talking to people not just about how it's gonna spontaneously happen, but how it spontaneously happens and how we might facilitate it spontaneously happening and that kind of thing.
That's like the thing that sort of the fundamental disease in politics, and there are plenty of elements in politics, but the phrase "something has to be done."
Right, we got to do something,
and it sort of assumes away the fact that every day there are billions of people doing something about like poverty. You just your last piece was on poverty and specifically what to do about persistent poverty in San Francisco, and we're all reading about the horror stories there.
Yeah.
But everybody that's running for president, and you've written a couple pieces that I want to get into.
Yeah.
Everybody that's running for president on the Democratic side, and by the way, the Republicans are equally guilty of all these things. The presumption is that here's a problem. It could be a real problem. Let's assume that it is a real problem. Politicians are capable of proposing not real problems as well.
Sure.
And they come up with a plan, and it's always, God help us, it's usually a 5-year plan, and there's a spreadsheet and there's a podium. But this gets back to your original disillusionment that if we just elected Elizabeth Warren, she's smart enough to restructure Amazon.
60 or 70 plans on her website.
Yeah. and let's start there, because you wrote a piece sort of, and by the way, I love your tone, and I love the way that you take technical, that's a hard word to say. My entire staff is lacking right now. Complex economics. And apply it to a public policy problem in a way that your pieces are short and they're understandable. But you ask some pretty tough questions of Elizabeth Warren, who thinks that if we just like break Amazon up, everything's going to be fine.
Yeah. So this actually speaks to like the way we teach people economics too, and what I've increasingly decided is a huge problem in the way that we teach it is that. Yeah, and this is what I fell in love with too. The Econ 101 starts with perfect competition. Under these conditions, markets are perfect, right? And that's going to lead to the best possible outcome. And then the rest, and a lot of people on the left say, well, that's brainwashing people about markets. Except that the rest of the book is about market failures, and here are the ways that the real world departs from those assumptions. And so the implication is it's the government's job to make it more like Chapter 1. That idea and that approach with the economy has sort of been like the centrist, like center left, center right consensus for a long time. And
the entirety of neoclassical economics,
really, yes,
is about
50,
equilibrium analysis.
Sure. And it's all about the outcome, about where it's theoretically supposed to go, which is an important thing too for us. What I appreciate in a sense about Warren is that she shows us what happens when you take that to its logical extreme. So Elizabeth Warren is a lawyer. I used to work with a lot of lawyers. She's not necessarily like them politically, but there's this sort of make it happen, this is what I want kind of mentality. And I think in her mind she says, oh, well, we need to just write down plans for everything. And even, my mother, my left-wing canary in the coal mine said to me, I went to her website and it's ridiculous. How does she think we're going to do all of this? And, it's, if you go, it's almost funny. There's 60 or 70 basically white papers sitting there. And I actually, if you made me choose up or down between Sanders or Warren, I'd take Sanders. Because I think that
your career is over.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I've already said things that alienate everybody on all sides. But no, I think Sanders wishes he could dismantle the private sector, but he knows he can't, and he kind of loses interest in it, and he just sort of thinks about his big plans.
He's like an ideologue, and she's she thinks she's smart enough that she could actually.
She wants to run the private sector.
There's that level of hubris that
Right.
that even Hillary Clinton didn't have.
Right, exactly. Corporations are great as long as they do what I want them to do, and I know what they should all do. And the problem with that is she has these things like accountable capitalism that says, well, you have to be accountable not just to your shareholders, but your workers and consumers. And on its head, I think people hear that and they say, great, except you can't implement that without an enormous amount of discretionary power in the government. And so all you've done is you've put all of these linkages together between the private sector and the public sector. And the other school of thought that I got introduced to when I, fell in with this crowd is called public choice. And it's, James Buchanan and others. We can drink to James.
Here's to James.
That really just says, people misrepresent it all the time, but it really just says government is a big organization of people, all with their own incentives and ideas and information, just like any other organization. And so saying the government is going to do this, you have to break that down and say, and think about it. And a lot of times you lose a lot of meaning when you treat it as a singular thing. And by the way, we do that. It's the state this, the state that.
Yeah.
And I think we actually lose a lot of understanding with that too. So
except for the deep state. I mean,
exactly. Well, yes,
that's a thing.
Yeah. Fine. So
by the way, so I don't know if you know Ed Lopez. He is a public choice professor, and we did an entire episode sort of talking about the contradiction of professional economists in a chattering class. When James Buchanan won the Nobel Prize, they mocked him for the simplicity of his theory. Politicians are just as self-interested as the rest of us.
Right.
And they're like, really, for that? But then they spent the rest of their time in their entire careers denying that was true.
Yeah.
And the entire macroeconomic project and all of these grand designs essentially is denying the fact that you can get weird outcomes because people in power are just as self-interested as the rest of us.
I think weird outcomes is such a key thing there because
weird, dangerous, and once in a while horrific.
Well, and weird in the sense that people they don't make sense to people. People see bad outcomes and they say a bad person must have caused that.
Yeah.
And the thing is, once you get to an organization of a certain size, that just isn't true necessarily. And that's not necessarily true of the state. That's not necessarily true of the billionaires and Wall Street. And so it's really all sides, I think, have to be responsible for that a little bit. And, when Warren and Sanders actually both do this is, they talk about billionaires in a way that suggests that there's like a room full of them, like mapping out how they're going to rig the system.
Jumping cigars.
Right. And saying, okay, so you take this and I'll do that and I'll call this person. And, I do think the well-connected have more, a disproportionate amount of political power, but it's not necessarily because of intentional bad acts, right? It's, this sounds silly, but think about if you went to the same school as elites who worked in government and you send your kids to the same piano teacher. And you said, if you have enough just interactions, points of contact, which rich elites are just going to have with government, in subtle ways, decisions are going to start to change. And when that number gets big enough, you get these weird outcomes. And that's not to say it's not a problem. That's not to say it's not worth thinking about. But sitting there and saying these evil billionaires or billionaire tiers or Occupy Wall Street or whatever is insidious in that it misunderstands the problem. And it directs us in a path that's at best going to not do anything.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, there's a thing to the insiders that all populists rail about. And it could be libertarian populists. It could be Trump populists, it could be Sanders populists, and there's very much an insider thing that is real in society, and I think it does corrupt outcomes, particularly when it comes to politics, because whether or not you and I like it, Jeff Bezos has better access to Senator so-and-so than we do.
And we're not going to change that.
Right.
A lot of policy, and this is true with technology too, especially, is like, let's try to make things like they were. or like they ideally, and that never works, and I do a lot of thinking about technology too, and you just, that's people's instinct, well, these Uber drivers don't get healthcare, so we need to make their jobs like a sort of archetype factory worker from the 1950s who works in the same factory for 40 years. And I think it's funny that all of a sudden the left is pining for like an idealized version of the 1950s in a way. And
well, it's idealized.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we didn't live it long. We were a lot poorer.
Yep.
And that cabal of insiders was still a thing.
Yeah.
And they still derived at least a significant part of their power from their relationship with government.
Right.
But let's wrap up on Elizabeth Warren, because there's all sorts of other hubris we need to touch. But and this is what I like about your writing, because in a lot of ways you're writing to your younger self, because you're trying to explain to young progressives why it is that breaking up Amazon or Google, fill in the blank, you do a lot of work on this stuff, that, it might sound good emotionally, but the end user is going to get hurt.
Right.
Because she doesn't know how to do it.
Right. And it's right. Most of our brains, other than maybe Hayek's, want to think about things as like cause and effect and linear narratives and things like that. And so when you don't have, when you don't specify a plan, everybody's mind goes to, let me think of the worst case scenario that can happen. Whereas when you say, when you give a plan that aspirationally has 100% coverage, then people's mind goes to like, okay, well, why don't you want to do that?
Yeah.
And whereas usually the latter is worse than the former. I worry with Warren that she could put together a sort of architecture of communication, but collaboration between the state and the private sector that, like, give it 3 or 4 more presidents, and you could have like a state capitalist, a China kind of. And I'm usually not the type to do those kind of alarmist projections. She actually, and I'm usually sort of almost compulsively try to see the good intentions in everybody. She really scares me.
Well, once you open that door, I mean, his history tells us that once government gets involved in the provision of X, and in this case it's technology, it's not like they're going away, because of all of this public choice dynamics and all of this stuff. She is probably my least favorite candidate of all the Democratic field, and I'll confess right now that I don't pay as much attention as I used to, because one, it's really depressing, and two, I did it for a lot of years as a profession, politics. I spent way too many lost years trying to improve political outcomes.
It's like me consulting,
but on the other end of the spectrum, I think Tulsi Gabbard is really interesting, and I sort of buy into some of the reasons that the Democratic machine keeps her off the stage. I think Bernie is interesting, but quite dangerous in some of his fundamental beliefs.
I'd say principled, but wrongly principled.
But that's like I do understand why Bernie bros exist, because I don't think, except for a few of them, I don't think they're socialists. I think they like the fact that he's anti-establishment. They like the fact that he's still the same crazy guy that he was 40 years ago when he was drinking topless in the Soviet Union. I unfortunately watched this video and I can't get it out of my mind.
Gosh. Yeah, I'm glad I may not be able to, just having heard of it.
But there are some interesting candidates, and you wrote a piece about another interesting candidate, Andrew Yang, former entrepreneur, and his whole thing is, to quote him, and I think I'm going to quote him right, I literally want to give people $1,000. Right. And that's the universal basic income, and he has an entire theory, and it's interesting that he comes from the tech world, but he believes that technology is going to make us all unemployed, and that someday in the not too distant future, you and I will be replaced by robots on this show. Yes. Which it'll probably be an improvement.
I mean, how can I be sure that you're not?
Well, I may be, but
exactly.
But you took him seriously, right? And you studied the report issued on this subject. So explain to people what Andrew Yang argues and
Right.
why you think he's misguided.
Right. So Yang has a story and a solution, basically. That and I, his fans on social media have reminded me he has these other policy proposals too. Absolutely,
the Yang Gang.
The Yang Gang, and they're actually the best supporters of any politician to interact with online. They come.
Yeah,
at,
I noticed that you
these,
said that they're thoughtful and
Yeah.
and they'll engage you in arguments instead of just tweeting at you. You will be the first in the gulag.
They'll come at you like these kind of aggro young dudes, and then they'll sort of if you kind of answer their question and show them respect, and they like actually want to hear why you think he's wrong and stuff. But so he says that automation is going to is basically going to put so many people out of a job that if we don't do some massive intervention, then all the money is just going to flow to the hands of a few owners of the capital, the machines. And the way around that is a universal basic income, which is basically to give everybody a check for $1,000 a month. Now, so there's kind of two things, and there's something wrong with both of them.
Because wealth will accumulate in a few hands.
Right.
The rest of us won't have jobs.
Won't have jobs.
And it's a
We
way
won't
of
be able to contribute anything of value.
redistributing the wealth.
Yes, exactly. First problem is the technology story. So in 1980, if you had said, we're going to lose a third of our manufacturing jobs and our population is going to go up by like half or something in 35, 40 years, you would say, oh my God, we have to do something, right? And that's what happened. And not as though we live in some kind of utopia, but there's about the same amount of unemployment as there was then. What happened? We switched to a different kind of economy. We gradually, in an evolutionary kind of way, moved towards more of a service-based, information-based economy. Now that is the underlying thing that's kind of causing a lot of the upheaval, kind of part of why we have the president we have. But all that to say, these aren't big events. Everybody, the way Yang thinks about it is though you take the technology of tomorrow and you drop it on the world today, all of a sudden. Well, that's not what happens. These are all a series, these are all thousands of events happening, and people respond to those events in real time, so that, people tend to be pretty good at figuring out how they can contribute something in order to thrive, right? And you can't sit there and plan out how that's going to happen when you're dealing with millions of people, but that's kind of the story he's telling. And the income side, now I've kind of looked at our welfare system too and things like that. And I will say that if somebody said to me, Max, let's take all of these ridiculous kind of insulting and paternalistic welfare programs that were started all the way back with Lyndon Johnson and, and have basically not changed the poverty rate, and cost double what it would cost to give people the money, and just, replace it with something like what Yang does for, some kind of, for the poor, I would say do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
But
and that's
yeah.
a basic economist's economic efficiency kind of argument that assumes away politics. If you could replace a train wreck that we call the welfare state that has actually, I mean, you're being a little generous. I think we've created institutionalized poverty.
And we've done so successively by having Republican and Democrat administrations say, well, they need to get married. Well, they need to eat vegetables. Yeah. Well, they need to, and it's become this maze of like 100 programs that are really, I think, condescending to the poor. But so in that sense, there's some merit to it. But then, he's an entrepreneur and he gets very elevator pitchy with this stuff. And he gets this is my big idea that I'm going to bring to the world. And the thing is, first of all, unless you're, like a kind of Sanders person who have their own kind of strange brand of macroeconomics, you got to finance this somehow. And,
I should ask, I don't know this, is the Yang $1,000 a month universal basic income, I assume that's an add-on on top of the existing welfare state? Or is he not,
as I
is he
sit
not
here
specific?
today, I don't remember. He talks about savings from other programs, but the big way he wants to finance is a sales tax, is a VAT, value-added tax.
Oof.
And Right. And that's actually a
Gee, who does that hit?
Yeah, so I actually once in my kryptonite on Twitter is I come up with funny things and think everybody needs to hear them. But, once Yang tweeted something like, "What are you going to do with $1,000 a month?" and I just retweeted it and said, "Pay your VAT."
Yeah.
And not that it would cover the whole thing, but the point is, these things are not neutral. You have to talk about how you're going to finance them, or if you're going to finance them. You have to talk about, because at that point, what you're looking at basically is a transfer plus a welfare system plus some extra debt or something like that, not just give you $1,000 a month. And I think Yang's problem is that he sees himself as having contributed to the world by being an entrepreneur, which he has. But the problem, this was probably my favorite title of anything I've written that I gave it, was "We Thrive Based on Many Andrew Yangs, Not One." Entrepreneurship involves millions of people having ideas. Some of them are good.
Unpack that, because I think it's a profound title.
It is. So we don't know in advance which ideas are going to be right. It's good to have entrepreneurs who maybe think a little bit more highly of their ideas than they are, because it kind of gives that energy. But we don't need them all to be right? We need them to be tested in the market. We need them to be and to respond to each other and evolve in all of these in these profound ways. And
we need them to fail.
Exactly. That's
a key part of your insight that I thought.
Yeah.
And I've talked to the ability to fail.
Yes.
And to pick yourself up and try something else.
Yep.
Is something that I think a lot of politicians promise that you're never going to fail.
Right.
You're never going to fail in life, and you're never going to fail in your marriage, and everything's going to be awesome. And and if you just let us take charge, here's the dignity that you starve for.
Right.
But frankly, that moment that you fail and you figure out how to pick yourself up, I think that's where dignity comes from.
Right. And it comes not just from that, but let me expand. It comes from when I fail, you seeing it and learning from it, and me responding to it, and this kind of network, this reverberating almost through. So it's not just
it's like iterations of research and failed paradigms and but that idea was pretty interesting. Let me try that this way.
Right. If we let every school district decide how they're going to educate their kids, there would be some bad things that happen. But after 20 years out and letting them copy each other, we'd know how to educate kids a lot better than we do today. And so that's what entrepreneurship really is. And I joke that, I'm a bad entrepreneur. I wouldn't be a good entrepreneur. But because of that, I have the perspective to tell you why entrepreneurship is good. Yang basically thinks that he has good ideas and he needs a big idea to take to the people. The problem is there's only one president. Yeah. And so that's a lot of eggs to put in one basket.
One president of the largest economy in the world is going to bet the farm on one idea, universal basic income.
Right. And even more than the deficit busting, and which is all important, what I really have a problem with, and this is with a lot of these candidates, is almost just the continuing of the public discourse of the solution to our problems is this, right? That's what everybody looks for. That's what we're kind of primed to look for. And that's what's increasingly not appropriate in our world that gets more complex, that gets more technological, everybody has a voice. We can debate the New Deal all we want. I would say that these kinds of programs are even more poorly suited than they were 100 years ago because of the ways that the world has changed.
It is fascinating that we particularly AOC in the context of the New Green Deal point to something from ancient times as a model for the future, and there does seem to be that hunger for the simplicity of we're all in this together and here's the plan, let's move forward.
Few things infuriate me more than the statement, we won World War II so we can do thing X that is totally different than beating another country in a war. And I'm not even getting into who won World War II, but that's nation states can beat other nation states at wars. They can concentrate a lot of power onto one target, right? environmental issues, climate change, that kind of thing, whatever it is, it arises from billions of decisions. It's nothing like winning a war.
Yeah.
And it's, and I think it's really damaging almost to the public dialogue. I don't necessarily think they know they're doing that, but that narrative is I think is really confusing to a lot of people.
Let's pivot. I think this model, and we're suggesting that there's a model that you can use to criticize proposed policies, based primarily on the fact that no single person knows enough to redesign complex systems. This is the Hayekian insight. And, we're pretty good at raging against the machine. We're pretty good at criticizing, dumb government pet tricks, and they abound. There's nothing but government failure around us. Yeah. But all that said, the persuasive sales pitch today seems to be politicians that say they want more power so they can do something for us. So explain this. Explain this, and I think the context of your article about poverty in San Francisco is probably a good place to pivot to what I really want to talk about. We need to explain to people who are attracted to this power argument all about the beautiful things that can happen when people are free to figure stuff out, fail, succeed, help each other, all the things that we know that free people do. That's the sales pitch we're not making very well.
Exactly. And, the other part of the standard argument of every politician is this is the other group from you that's to blame for that. That almost is so
always a demonization of
exactly
fill in the blank. It could be billionaires.
And it's uncomfortable to say this, but billionaires for the left right now occupy the same role that Mexican immigrants and Chinese trading partners occupy for Trump.
Yeah.
And, and that doesn't mean that they're not, less vulnerable than immigrants or whatever, but it really is the same thing. Now, in San Francisco, there is this problem with entrenched homelessness. And that's happened for, again, a complex set of reasons. There's, it's the right loves to talk about how permissive San Francisco is about everything. It's true. The weather's nice. And at the same time, they had this tech boom where everything got really expensive, but the people already living in the city wanted to keep the city, there it is again, exactly the same as it was. And had all these zoning rules and all these, and rents are now, it's like one bedroom, $3,700 or something like that. Anyway, I lived there for a couple of years when I went to Stanford, which is nearby, and it was already, if you went to the Tenderloin, which is sort of the downtown, like right next to downtown, in San Francisco, and really a part of the city people go to, too. That's the interesting thing, is that this is all happening where people, this is not happening, in isolated neighborhoods. It was already more intense, let's just say, in terms of the homelessness, the sort of public drug use, than anything I'd ever seen a dozen years ago. I was there last year, and it was like nothing I have ever seen. And
it's horrific today.
It is
one of my favorite cities historically in the world.
Yep.
And Terry and I, my wife, we won't go to that part of San Francisco.
It's tough. And it was I remember Nick Gillespie was interviewing Dan Carlin, who I'm a huge fan of, the history podcaster, and he has some libertarian sensibilities, but he said something like, what are we gonna do about homelessness? And that's what people are after, is what is the magic solution? And even sort of libertarians, free market advocates like to say, get rid of the zoning laws, which yes, they should get rid of the crazy zoning laws in San Francisco, but I don't necessarily think that someone suffering from mental illness and, horrible drug addiction, and because rent goes down by $500 is gonna, that's gonna help people move to the city, middle class people. I was sort of, I was thinking about it for a long time after I was there. And one day, a few weeks ago, I was on a flight actually coming back from somewhere. I started kind of surfing the internet, and I found this charity that it's called At the Crossroads. And basically they get to know people. They especially target kids who have had lots of trouble, have been kicked out of other programs. and they kind of go out in the street and start talking to them. And they
one at a time.
Yeah, one at a time, and who they are and what their goals are, and they don't have any set agenda. And they say they offer unconditional support. That to the right, that's supposed to be anathema. And part of what I sort of thought about in writing about that is it's not really unconditional. It's they will interface with them, unconditionally, but they have a human being who knows them, who, like our friend Hayek, can respond, to facts on the ground that
he would well, actually, Michael Polanyi would call
Yep.
it personal knowledge.
Yes.
The knowledge of time and place, and
Yeah.
then the entire
Yeah.
Austrian understanding of knowledge is like, if you have this theory of poverty, but you actually haven't spoken to individual people that are struggling with poverty, you don't know. You don't know what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny that the people who most avidly talk about workers, quote unquote, are probably the people who know the fewest people who fit into that category in their minds. That
Yeah, they've never actually worked one of those jobs.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Like so they get to know people. They think about what kind of services they need. And really, there's nothing more accountable than a social relationship in some ways, and the kind of sticks and carrots that you can get from that.
Yeah.
Even if and you are going to be there tomorrow, whether the person does X, Y, or Z, because it's not one rule to everybody. If you have a job guarantee, a really salient criticism is, how can you be fired if you don't show up late? Well, that's because there's one rule that everybody gets a job. If you show up late to meeting with this person, there's all sorts of social pressure, of decisions about aid that can be made. There's, it's like a million little pieces of accountability instead of one big piece.
Yeah.
It's hard to measure the success of these things. This thing is small. I don't want to act like it's, a panacea. I think that, again, the debate is sort of what is going to be our solution to this problem. And it's, we need 1,000 small solutions, but it's like almost like a challenge everybody, myself certainly included, to just like get to know one person. And
there's
what would happen?
There's probably like two categories of solutions, but you're suggesting a level of humility that that there's no silver bullet to any social problem we have. We could certainly, and we libertarians are very good at identifying like problems created by government barriers, government regulations, government prohibitions, and in San Francisco, you could certainly point at limits on housing as one problem. The war on drugs is another problem, and we could probably tick off 10 more.
Sure.
But the other half of that, and this is going to be my somewhat inelegant pivoting to the beauty of the process of free people figuring stuff out. The other half is very bottom up. It's face to face. It's person to person. And I think there's a lot of, and I've said this 1,000 times on this show, I think there's a lot of fans of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and who knows who else, who believe that democratic socialism is that bottom-up process. They believe that it's person-to-person, working together, solving problems.
Because their mental model is like 5 people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And we're the guys very much opposed to any brand of socialism, democratic or otherwise, who have this theory of how it is that free people solve problems. Yeah. And if you don't believe me, you got to go to the parking lot of a Grateful Dead concert, because it should be dangerous. It should be chaos.
Yep.
It should be a place where normal, respectable people don't go. But when you go there, you discover a thriving marketplace of people that respect each other, that respect each other's property. They don't hurt each other. They don't take their stuff. They trade. They cooperate. And they care not just about themselves, but about the community.
Right. And that, it's what really strikes me is that exchange, capitalism, I would say, forms the backbone of that network. But then there's also, because of that interaction and that trust and that commonality, there's basically a lot of governance and safety net kind of features that are being voluntarily fulfilled by these people who are basically driving around following a band from concert to concert. And that's sometimes I wonder when we talk about capitalism, I don't want a new name. I don't want us to have a new name. I sometimes wonder, do we need a new name? Because people, and even our folks, often just think of it as corporations and commerce. I kind of want to think about free society and the freedom to cooperate, to act, to do all of that. To me, that's part of it, and part of sort of my dream.
I like the
is
word
to take,
cooperation.
Yeah, and part of my real dream is to take deadheads or fishheads, these hippies who probably would ask them about capitalism and they wouldn't have something nice to say, is not to change their minds, but to convince them they are part of capitalism.
Yeah.
And actually convince our friends they're part of capitalism too.
Yeah.
At the same time, but it's not an aesthetic that a lot of people necessarily like.
I'm not a fan of the word.
Yeah.
I don't think that the market process is about capital accumulation. It's one of the consequences of the market process is that successful entrepreneurs accumulate capital and they reinvest that, and that's a very beneficial dynamic. But going back to the Grateful Dead parking lot, there is no government, but there's governance, and I'm a huge Deadhead, as you know, and I totally did a deep dive in this Grateful Dead series that was on Amazon. I think it was called A Long Strange Trip.
Yeah, I watched it.
And there was interviews with Jerry Garcia that I'd never seen before, and it sort of emphasized the fact that he was an anarchist, and he was an anarchist not in the sense that he wanted to burn anything down or sucker punch anybody. He was an anarchist in the sense that he wanted to let everybody in his community, and this is a guy with a lot of power in his community, he wanted to let them make their own decisions, and he very adamantly said, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. And the net result of that was a very successful enterprise. They were always on the Fortune whatever as a band. The Jerry Garcia's career has outlived him by at least 20 years now, and that's pretty impressive. And that community functioned in a fairly effective and efficient way, almost exclusively because he didn't want to tell them what to do.
Right.
And it seems counterintuitive.
Right.
Who's running this show? And his point was nobody's running this show.
Yep. And it's important that it was, we say anarchy, and that's the absence again of government, not of governance. And
I'm not a big fan of that word either.
Yeah.
I use it with some trepidation, even though Logan prefers when I use the word, because the technical meaning is absence of government.
We've all got our favorite words.
Yeah.
People like to say liberal. That's not what most people think a liberal is. And I think like us coming from different kind of backgrounds, like I'll hear you describe things as conservative that I don't think of as conservative, but I totally agree with.
Yeah.
But
when we use the word anarchy, and you will, people in our community will call themselves anarcho-capitalists, which is a mashup of two words that carry so much misinformation and mismeaning. But when we use the word anarchy, what we're really talking about is peaceful cooperation.
Right. And
I don't know why we don't use the phrase voluntary cooperation instead.
And to me, coming from a slightly different background where I didn't grow up reading the same books and going to the same school as sort of a lot of people did, to me the thing about individualism that gets me out of bed in the morning is the freedom to cooperate with the people you want to cooperate with. That to me is the engine, the lifeblood that kind of drives society. And I think that the hippies in the lot of a Dead show or a Fish show or whatever are helping each other, they're transacting, and it's without any top-down guidance, but it is with intentionality by the people too.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, some of the part of what we miss sometimes is we love to say the market will take care of it or people will take care of it. And if you're already sort of bought in and you've already thought about market processes and these economists and things like that, you get that. I don't think a lot of people get that. And in fact, they get it so little that I really have a hard time sort of moving people on it really at all. And in all honesty, I think that's why Hayek, why we kind of say like, man, was he the best writer? Or was he? I don't know that it was really, if I could accomplish one thing in my career, which I don't think I could accomplish, it would be presenting Hayek's thinking in a way that's like intuitively resonates with everybody.
Yeah.
And it's hard because it's that bottom-up complexity that I don't think our brains are quite, most of ours at least.
Well, that's why these stories and
exactly.
And I want to give people some context. If you're not a Deadhead or a Fish fan, you probably don't know what the hell we're talking about. And these bands have very different styles.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair to say that Fish very much was a beneficiary of the Grateful Dead culture and
took their format as a show, as for shows and tours and that kind of thing too.
Yeah, and it's and the logic of it was essentially no one's going to play us on the radio,
right?
But we're gonna build an enthusiastic audience that is going to follow us from place to place.
Right.
The Grateful Dead famously allowed their fans to record the shows and trade them,
as did Fish until basically technology got to the point where that didn't.
Yeah, it doesn't matter anymore because now any of this stuff is out there.
Stuff's out there an hour later on the internet. Yeah.
But so you have I have this community that is packed up, and their life is following these bands around, and necessarily a marketplace emerges in that culture. And when I describe it's called Shakedown Street, but when I describe the Grateful Dead parking lot, I'm talking about thousands of fans that have dedicated a life to following this band, and they're selling T-shirts, they're preparing food, they're creating a complex marketplace that packs and unpacks every day depending on the show.
Yep.
Fish picked up that culture.
It did.
And if you would go to a Fish concert today or this summer, you will see a vibrant culture of people that are enthusiastically into the band, but they're also into the community that has evolved spontaneously around the band.
And that's where I love the Dead. Garcia died about 2 years before I started getting exposed to a lot of this music. Should say for people who don't know that these bands, why do people follow them from concert to concert other than it's just fun to be on a road trip, is every concert's different. They play, they have big canons of songs, big songbooks. They improvise a ton, and that's sort of group improvisation rather than somebody soloing, which, hey, look at that. It's people on the ground responding to each other in real time. What does that remind you of? And it depends on the venue. It depends on where it is. It's interesting how all those things shape what emerges. But like I said in the beginning, my boss is Jeffrey Tucker, who is wears his suits with his bow ties and loves music from the Gilded Age. And I dream of taking him to one of these shows where I know there's going to be a good emergent marketplace, because you got the Jeffrey Tucker article about that would be epic. That he would write.
For those who don't know him, he's very much into classical music, and he I think he respects the technical acumen of correctly performing a complex concerto, which in a lot of ways is the opposite of what we're talking about here. And at least with the Grateful Dead, I mean, the Fish has very different influences. They're into to Zappa and all of that kind of stuff. But the Grateful Dead were very much influenced by John Coltrane, Miles Davis, bluegrass, Americana, a lot of mashed up influences. But the structure of jamming, I think, comes from jazz.
Right.
And I can't fully explain it musically, but I like the analogy, because a good Grateful Dead Dark Star, which could go on for about 30 minutes, could go on for 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. There's a little bit of structure, and there's a lot of room for improvisation and exploration and experimentation. But what you said earlier is everything about jam bands. Like you have a band of 4, 5, 6
Yeah.
people, depending on which band we're talking about,
Yep.
who have to be comfortable enough with each other that they're communicating
Right.
and they're feeding off of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And some days it's total garbage.
Right.
And some days it's the most transcendent thing you will ever hear.
Exactly. And that's, it's not, variation in the quality of concerts is sort of, I think, central to the jam band drama that makes it interesting, that makes it like you're kind of rooting for them.
Yeah.
When you go see them. But it's also, I think, in ways we don't even fully understand, shapes the quality of the music and the way that they listen and learn from each other and all of that. And I think Fish really increasingly, as the years went on, got more like the Dead in that regard, in that their really long improvs didn't have a destination, could go on for 5 minutes or could go on for a half hour. This past New Year's, every few years they'll do a version of a song Tweezer that'll be like 35 minutes long or something like that.
And the one this year was
Yeah.
It's better than anything I've ever done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll upset some fish heads for saying
that. The one from this New Year. Yeah. From 12/3. Yeah, it is really impressive. It's they did 13 shows, the Baker's Dozen, at Madison Square Garden in 2017, and they didn't repeat a song in 13 shows, which baffles people.
By the way, is not easy to do.
No, it actually did require a little bit more planning, I think, than they usually did. But in terms of transcendence, and in terms of, this was a band I was following around a little bit when I was in college. I joked that I was like a Midwestern college kid in the late 90s. I'm almost demographically required to like Fish. But I remember the day of the show, how excited I was. And it was it was mind-blowing that there in 2017 they kind of made me feel like I was 22 again.
Yeah.
In a way that doesn't, I'm 41 now, and I like watching these webcasts at home a lot of the time. Like that'll do it for me. But you can have
that's like an
those
old
moments.
Man thing. Like you can get to bed at a decent hour and still see the show.
but again, and that's actually a great segue to technology and the ways that people talk about what's lost, and there are things that are lost when technology advances. The culture of trading cassettes, of that did create unique bonds among people. And markets aren't perfect; they make mistakes. That's a feature, not a bug, as I like to say. But you can't stop it. You can't. And what you get instead now is you pay $10 a month for an app that's got every jam band on it. An hour after they play the show, you could stream the whole thing.
Nugs.net.
Yep. Or, Fish has their own app because they're big.
Live Fish.
Yep.
I unfortunately, from my wife's accounting of my expenditures, I buy all this stuff.
Yeah. I have both of those. It's funny because the smaller bands, it'll take like a week for the shows to go up. Fish will be like 12 minutes after the show's done. It's up there.
Yeah.
And it's actually similar to music in general, where you have Spotify now, where it's like almost like our sense of entitlement with the internet. So it is so fun. Like, we think we should be able to listen whenever we want, wherever we want, to whatever we want. And we almost get a little mad when we can't. When some band has decided not to put their stuff on it or something like that.
Well, it's radically democratic.
It is, yeah.
And young people today, if you're 20 years old today, and you, as an old man, I would tell them stories of the days when I had to go to a box record store, and some monster from the music industrial complex decided that I could only consider these 50 albums, or maybe there was 100, but now there's an infinite number, and you can sort of crowdsource that stuff, and that's why and let's wrap this up. But this metaphor of jam bands, because I'm, other than Tucker Carlson and Ann Coulter, who are famous or infamous deadheads, that entire audience is probably skewing quite progressive. There's some Bernie Bros in those audiences.
John Fishman, Fish's drummer, is a noted Sanders supporter.
He's an explicit Bernie guy, but
Yep.
they're living this spontaneous
Yes.
order dream. They're living a vibrant capitalism
That's what I want to tell them.
where other people care about each other.
Yeah.
And there's something we could learn when we're trying to communicate these ideas to people sort of outside of our little bubble.
Yeah. And I think there are some of the people I interact with on Twitter or whatever, like, they can learn we can care about each other. We don't have to apologize and say we come first before we say we can help people. We're not talking about taxation and the government, and that some people's identities have kind of gotten very invested in that, I think. And when I offer a vision of free markets that doesn't let somebody think they're better than other people, that is terrifying in a way. But it's like we need to learn, and we need to teach others that, especially in the world we live in now, in the ways we connect, in the ways we can learn about things that are so, different than they were 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that, are back to doing so. We have to change what we mean by doing something, and we have to change what we expect by doing something. That doesn't mean we have to do nothing.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's hard to put into words, and that's something I struggle with all the time. And frankly, the reason is it's not for me to put into words. It's for me to enunciate a little piece of, and somebody else to enunciate a little piece of, until we're doing it. So and I think that it is happening, even if it's not happening on our schedule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where do people find your stuff?
Yes. So the American Institute for Economic Research, so I got to do a little plug. We've actually been around for over 80 years, or maybe almost 80 years. I'm the one person who's not going to know the exact year, and I'm sorry, guys. But in 1930s,
we'll fix it in post.
Yeah. We were founded by called Magnus, and he'll know exactly everything. We were founded by Edward C. Harwood, who was an engineer actually in the Army, who was at MIT for a while and sort of a self-trained economist, and started us in Cambridge, was an outspoken critic of the New Deal, actually went back to the Army during World War II, and all the while ended up buying all the way on the other side of the state, sort of this fixer-upper mansion that really had gone into disrepair, that was owned before that by the Pearson family, who, this is sad, and yet this is just an amazing piece of history, died on the Lusitania, the ship that sunk that got the U.S. partially into World War I, and fixed up this mansion and sort of created this institute in the middle of nowhere, in an area that's sort of become a like weekend home area for New York, but that's almost new, in a way, and there we are on this beautiful campus that. He passed away in 1980, and you know how nonprofits go. When you have, you need a direction. You need sort of a common set of ideas, and I think they struggled with that for a little while. You bring in Ed Stringham and Jeffrey Tucker, and sense of purpose is not a problem.
Yeah.
And, and we've put together a network of writers who... a lot of the big academics in the free market space, Pete Boettke, others, and several of us in-house, Phil Magnus and Peter Earl and myself, Bob Hughes, who were just really proud of our work. And, I would say our commentary from a free market economics kind of standpoint is pretty unparalleled. I mean, lots of places do great work, and I'm not trying to suggest that, but if you go to AIER.org, it's a tough acronym. It's 3 vowels in a row. That's maybe not what you would pick today. AIER.org. We have several articles a day that I would say are aimed at kind of the interested general public.
Yeah.
And that's really what I like. I'm the one who I have to set up the structure to do the longer PhD stuff. I work best when I kind of have one foot in the academic stuff and one foot in talking to the public about it. And
I really think you guys are creating something special, and I've wanted sort of a modern update of what I would call an Austrian economics think tank.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of very powerful stuff that you guys are doing, but it's practically applied to world as it is, not just this rarefied world of that some libertarians live
And
in.
without casting too many stones, we also don't run around telling people that everything that isn't by these three Austrian economists is a lie.
Yeah.
Which some people do.
Yeah.
And it really is, I think there are such important ideas that come from these economists that are criminally ignored by the field. And a lot of that is that they don't lend themselves well to math. And, senior faculty don't like to hire junior faculty that do things differently than they do. But we have to clean our side of the street.
Yeah.
And we have to go out and engage these people and talk to them. There's people love to get outraged at all these millennials saying they're socialists, right? And I've been on TV a couple of times talking about this, and I've written about it. But if we don't tell them, we have the voice about why they shouldn't be socialists, why they should support free markets. If we're not out there telling them that, that's why they think that's why they're socialists, right? And so we have to couple our outrage with a little bit of talking to people and meeting them halfway. And I think we do a pretty good job of doing that.
Talking and listening. And,
Yes.
and let's end with a challenge to Jeffrey Tucker, who thinks that he will be abhorred by going to a Dead show. The Dead are coming to Fenway.
Yep.
In Boston. What's like less than 2 hours from the mothership.
Yep.
We should challenge Jeffrey to show up for a 2-night run of the Dead.
Two nights. Woo.
He can wear a double-breasted suit. He can wear a bow tie, high collar. But if he wants to understand how markets work, he needs to immerse himself in that.
This is true, and he will be amazed, and he will have something to say about it that will surprise us all. And we'll make it happen. If he's off talking at some conference or something, we'll do it another time. I'll make him go. You'll make him go.
No, we're gonna make him go.
Yeah.
Okay, cheers. Thanks,
all right.
Max. Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.